What would you do if you were in the middle of a vast desert, with no one around and faced with a decision that could forever change another family's life? A moment of pure uncertainty where the stakes are far greater than any personal choice. Sounds like a nightmare, right? But for Jake Thunder McCall, a cowboy from the Old West, this was his reality. A man marked by loneliness, but with a courage few could understand. And what he did in that moment will surprise you. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover can teach you much more than you can imagine about the true meaning of courage, compassion, and most importantly, decisions that can save lives. The story you're about to hear is about how a cowboy, a man known for his toughness and skill with a revolver, became the last hope for a Native American family who, in a simple act of fate, found themselves at the mercy of violence and prejudice. Imagine the scene: the blazing desert sun, the sound of the wind cutting through the air, and on the horizon, an imminent battle. Jake, unaware of what awaited him, was about to face a dilemma so profound that it would confront him with his own values and, who knows, change his outlook on life forever. Have you ever been through something like this? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to decide between following your instincts or doing what seemed impossible? Imagine that in that moment, an entire family depended on your decision. All Jake knew was that if he took the easy way out, he would be handing over the lives of innocent people into the hands of those who had no compassion, only a thirst for power. It was his word against a real war. But what happened next, believe me, defies all expectations of what a cowboy can be. Instead of charging into battle like so many would, Jake found himself forced to rely on something beyond his skill with a gun. He had to trust his own heart. What he did to save those strangers, those who had nothing to do with his world, was something few people would have the courage to do. And it's that courage, that sacrifice, that will move you. In a time where alliances were made in blood and the enemy was always lurking, the story of Jake Thunder McCall will show you that true strength comes not from what you can destroy, but from what you are willing to protect, even when the price is high. But, as with every great story, what Jake faced was nothing compared to what was to come. And that's exactly what we're about to reveal. So if you're still there, taking a deep breath and wondering how this all connects, stay with me, because the next chapter of this journey will affect you in ways you never imagined. And, as incredible as it may seem, the best is yet to come. And when Jake finally made his decision, something shifted inside him. The weight of saving those strangers, of choosing another family's life above everything he'd ever known, transformed his perspective on what truly matters. And you know, I keep thinking, how many times in our lives do we have to make a difficult decision where the stakes are so much higher than just our own well-being? How many times are we challenged to do what's right, even when it seems impossible? That's precisely what Jake teaches us, that true courage lies not in facing the enemy, but in facing the doubt and pain within ourselves. Now tell me, what would you do if you were in his shoes? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between protecting what's right and taking the easy way out? Share your experience or opinion in the comments. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on all of this and how this story touches you. And if you haven't liked the video yet, now's the perfect time. Your like not only helps show that you value this kind of content, but also gives us more strength to continue bringing you stories that touch your heart, like that of Jake and this native family. And if you're enjoying this journey, if you want to continue delving deeper into these inspiring stories about the Wild West, about courage and decisions that change destinies, subscribe to the channel. This is more than just a click. It's a commitment to content that can truly impact the way you see the world. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. And believe me, every subscription, every comment, every like helps us continue bringing you stories as powerful as this one. Now stay with me, because what comes next will leave you speechless. Jake Thunder McCall wasn't the kind of man defined solely by his appearance. Tall, imposing, and with the unwavering gaze of someone who had faced the worst adversities, he possessed a presence that made everyone around him step aside in respect. The other cowboys called him Thunder, not only for his unrivaled skill with a gun, but for his fearless stance in the face of any challenge. He feared neither the unknown nor the storms the Wild West often brought. But there's something few knew. beneath all that toughness, Jake carried a rare compassion, a heart that beat not only for survival, but for justice, for the dignity of all, regardless of who they were. Sometimes on a journey like the Wild West, you end up molded by the need to be unbeatable, almost invincible. But it's precisely when you encounter situations that can't be resolved by force, when what's at stake isn't just your own interests, that you discover who you really are. And it was in those moments that Jake had the chance to reveal his true nature. There, alone in the vastness of the desert, with no one to help, he found himself faced with a choice few, in fact, would have the courage to make. It wasn't about winning a battle. It wasn't about proving he was the best cowboy, the strongest, or the fastest. It was about being willing to go further, to embrace the humanity he'd tried so hard to hide. Because that's how great transformations happen, isn't it? When someone is forced to face the hidden truth about themselves, and more than that, to decide what legacy they will leave to others. Jake Thunder. McCall knew what the world expected of him. He knew that as a cowboy, his reputation was what kept him alive, what earned him respect and even protection. But at that moment, the true test of his courage wasn't how he would deal with the enemies before him. It was how he would deal with what was inside him: empathy, the will to protect those who in the eyes of most were worthless. In Jake's world, where everything seemed to boil down to a simple matter of power, he was about to discover that true strength comes not from what you can dominate, but from what you can protect. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because this part of Jake's story is a true lesson for us all. When we talk about courage, we often think of epic confrontations, like the ones he fought in several battles. But what I want to show you here is that true courage is not measured by what you face, but by what you are able to support and save, even when it doesn't align with what society expects of you. Cowboy Jake, in that moment, found himself facing something more complex than a simple shootout. He was about to do something that would thrust him into unfamiliar territory, where the rules he'd followed his entire life no longer applied. What would he do when challenged by someone's humanity other than his own? When he had to defend those most would consider enemies? That's not something we expect from a cowboy, is it? But this is the true transformation that occurs in a heart willing to follow true justice, true courage. By making his decision, Jake not only altered the destiny of a native family, but also his own. And this, my friends, teaches us that great choices don't just happen when we look to the future, but often when we look within ourselves. That's exactly what makes this story so powerful. We're not just talking about a physical struggle, but a true internal struggle, a decision that goes far beyond what the common worldview teaches us. And when you understand this, when you realize that it's in the most unexpected situations that the greatest transformations unfold, you begin to see life in a completely different way. And that's why, when we talk about Jake, we're not just talking about a Wild West cowboy. We're talking about decisions that, in some way, teach us about our own character. Jake's courage is something that reflects on our own choices, in those moments when we often have to decide between what's easy and what's right, between ego and true justice. Now tell me, have you ever had a moment where you had to decide between doing the right thing and the easy thing? How did you react? I really want to hear your thoughts on this, because it's in stories like this that we discover that what unites us most is not our differences, but the courage to do what's right, regardless of who the other side is. A hot afternoon in the Arizona desert, the scorching sun burning the skin and the wind like a scorching blast sweeping across the vast, arid land. Jake Thunder McCall, mounted on his horse, continued on his way, another solitary journey, another day in the vast and unpredictable Wild West. He knew what it was like to live in the shadows, where the only companion was the sound of his own thoughts. Solitude was his ally, and the days passed slowly, almost as if time was something distant, something he no longer needed to fear. But that day, fate had something different in store for him, something that would change everything. What Jake didn't expect was that, in the middle of the desert, the wind would bring more than just dust. He heard screams in the distance, a high-pitched, desperate sound that cut through the air. It wasn't the screams of animals or men in combat. It was the sound of human anguish. Jake's instinct, always sharp, slowed his horse. He leaned forward, sensing the tension building in the air. His eyes, ever vigilant, soon spotted what was happening. a native family being attacked by a group of armed men. It was the Apache tribe, one of the most respected and feared in the West. But at the moment, all Jake could see was a group of women and children being brutally attacked, running desperately as they tried to escape the approaching inferno. What shocked him most, however, was not the brutality of the attack, but the swiftness with which the men acted. They weren't just mercenaries or bounty hunters. They were unscrupulous men, driven by greed and a thirst for destruction. And in a land like that, where every day was a struggle for survival, it was easy to see how death could strike without warning. Jake immediately felt adrenaline surge through him. He knew that if he stood there, just watching, something terrible would happen. But he also knew that going in alone might be the last mistake he ever made. This wasn't the kind of fight he could win with a simple shootout or an ambush, especially with women and children involved. Something inside him told him that, no matter how absurd and even untenable the situation, he couldn't turn away. What would he do now? Stand back and follow his path as many would, or risk everything to protect those who, in the eyes of so many, were nothing more than enemies? Jake felt the weight of the decision. In that moment, the desert became a battlefield not only between men, but between values, courage, and compassion. And he knew that once again he was being challenged, not by the strength of his enemies, but by the strength of his own soul. Because the hardest battles are not those against others, but those against ourselves. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because true transformation happens when we're faced with choices that make us question who we truly are. Jake's decisions, in that moment, weren't just about saving a life or avoiding conflict. They were about taking a step towards something greater, a purpose. And perhaps you, at some point in your life, have found yourself at a crossroads like this, where the decision isn't just about what you can gain, but about what you can sacrifice. What would you do when another human being's life depended on your actions, when you were the only one who could make a difference? It's at this precise moment that we see Jake's true nature, and the question that remains is, did he have what it took to do what no one else would dare? To risk his life, his reputation, and even his very survival for a cause greater than himself? That's the beauty of Old West stories. They make us question our own limitations, our own values. Make no mistake, Jake was about to make a decision that would not only alter the fate of those people, but also his own. And when we talk about making decisions of this magnitude, we're talking about choices that echo into eternity, transforming everyone involved. This is the turning point in a story that goes beyond simple survival. It's about the true essence of being human, about allowing yourself to be more than what others expect of you. And in the end, what he would do there, in that desperate moment, would be the proof of his true courage. Because sometimes, it's in the darkest hours that we see who we truly are. And who Jake would become would depend entirely on that choice. Jake stood still for a moment, watching the scene of destruction unfold before him. Smoke rose from the ground, the sound of screams still echoed in his ears, and the desperation of those Apache women and children running for their only chance of survival seemed to reverberate in the very air. He knew the situation was about to turn deadly, but more than anything else, Jake knew that the decision he made in that moment would define not only the fate of those natives, but also his own, in ways he had never imagined. The dilemma Jake faced wasn't just about what to do to save those lives. He knew that acting meant putting his own life at risk, but he also knew there was something even heavier weighing on his shoulders: prejudice. The Old West, with all its brutality and complexity, was a place where Native Americans were seen as enemies, as a threat to the empire of American expansion. The war between whites and Native Americans, fueled by visceral hatred, had left deep scars on the land and in the souls of the people. Jake, like many cowboys, carried with him the beliefs and prejudices of the time. But in that moment, he felt something different within himself, something that challenged everything he had ever believed. He had faced many enemies throughout his life, bandits, bounty hunters, even other cowboys. But this was no ordinary battle. He faced a choice that challenged his own character, his morality. Everything he believed was right. It was an internal struggle that went beyond any physical confrontation. How could he defend a Native American family when his own culture had taught him to see them as a threat? How could he break the chains of a mindset that had been nurtured by generations of hostility? Doubt began to consume Jake. He knew that tensions between whites and Native Americans in the Old West often ended in death. History was full of massacres and violent confrontations where Native lives were valued as nothing in the eyes of most settlers. Jake's internal struggle wasn't just a matter of choice, but of hidden truth. He wasn't just challenging society's prejudices, he was challenging the very ghosts he carried within, rooted in his deepest beliefs. Society told him he should leave those Native Americans to their fate, but something inside him screamed otherwise. He faced a difficult decision. If he chose to ignore that family's suffering, he could continue his journey without risk, as many would. But in that moment, he felt something in his soul, driving him to do more. Something told him that if he didn't act, he would be becoming as guilty as the armed men who attacked those people. The voice of compassion within him was stronger than the weight of the prejudices he carried. He knew that by facing internal resistance and social pressure, he was taking a step not only toward saving lives, but toward transforming his own understanding of true courage. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because the decision Jake faced isn't just about saving a life. It's about questioning the belief systems we've formed throughout our lives. How often do we act according to what society expects of us, without questioning whether that truly aligns with our deepest values? The real struggle often is against the prejudices imposed on us, against the limiting ideas we carry. And this is what makes Jake's journey so relevant to all of us. True courage lies not in fighting a visible enemy, but in fighting the invisible ghosts that inhabit our minds. Jake was about to cross an invisible line, challenging not only the status quo of the Old West, but the very fabric of his mindset, his worldview. In doing so, he was taking a step toward transformation, both for himself and for everyone around him. And that, my friends, is the kind of decision that can change not only the course of a life, but the very destiny of an entire journey. And when it comes to making decisions like this, we all have a choice. We can follow the standards, the conventions, what everyone expects of us, or we can make the difficult decision to defy those expectations and do what's right, even when the cost is high. Jake felt the weight of decision solidify on his shoulders, but he no longer had time to hesitate. The screams echoed closer, and the sound of heavy footsteps mixed with gunfire increased the pressure on his chest. He already knew what to do. The moment of action had arrived. Without further thought, without further doubt, he drew his gun and fired at the men attacking the native family. The boom of the revolver cut through the tense silence of the desert, and the dust rose in a cloud that seemed to engulf the scene in an explosion of adrenaline and chaos. Jake was no stranger to battle. The cowboy had faced his share of confrontations, but as he aimed at one of the men and felled him, he knew this would be no simple shootout. The enemy outnumbered them, and their intentions weren't just robbery or intimidation. They were here to kill, to exterminate. The fight wasn't just for survival, it was for the lives of innocents, for an entire family's chance to escape certain death. It was something much bigger than Jake's personal struggle. He was in the middle of a confrontation that defied the laws of nature, the very rules of the Wild West. The crossfire was instantaneous. Shots rang out from all sides, dust rising with the speed of the hot wind. Jake moved quickly, slipping between the cacti and rocks as he tried to assess the situation. With every shot, every movement, he felt the weight of responsibility bearing down on him. He knew he couldn't save everyone, couldn't protect every single Apache. The battle was lost, but at least he had a chance to do something, to make a difference, even if it was just for one person, one life that would be saved. The battle was no longer just physical. It was a mental and emotional struggle as well. Each shot he fired felt heavier than the last. Jake had to act quickly, but he also knew that haste could be fatal. He couldn't be impulsive, couldn't be reckless. As strong and determined as he was still just one man, and the enemy was many. His mind raced as he tried to analyze the terrain, assess every move, and at the same time protect the Native American family that depended on him. He was in enemy territory, and every step could be his last. The violence was palpable. The sound of revolvers mingled with screams of pain, with the sound of bullets ricocheting off the rocks, creating a seemingly endless spectacle of destruction. But amidst it all, there was something else. Courage. The courage of a man who, despite how much the world had taught him to ignore others, was putting himself at risk to save those who, in the eyes of many, were worthless. The courage that drove Jake came not from his skill with a gun, but from his determination to do what he knew was right, despite all the obstacles. Adrenaline coursed through his veins. As he fired again, aiming for one of the men about to attack the tribeswoman, he knew the chances of winning this fight were slim. That victory seemed distant, but he couldn't stop. The cowboy felt the weight of responsibility in every muscle in his body. He knew that with every passing second, more lives were at stake. This wasn't just about his survival. This wasn't just about his honor or his pride as a cowboy. It was something deeper. This was about humanity, about doing the right thing, regardless of the consequences. Time seemed to slow down, and Jake felt like every shot, every movement was an eternity. But he couldn't stop. He had to keep fighting. Fight to ensure that this family had a chance. Even if it meant risking his life, even if it meant defying the odds. He was there in that violent confrontation because he knew that sometimes the greatest battles aren't against others, but against the inner doubts that paralyze us. And as the fight continued, Jake remembered what was truly at stake, the chance to make a difference. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic because when we talk about courage, we're not just talking about doing something extraordinary in a dangerous situation. We're talking about doing the right thing, even when everything inside you tells you to back down. Jake, with his hands firmly on his revolver, was facing the biggest battle of his life, and the decision he made there would define not only that moment, but the person he would become. After all, the choices we make in the heat of battle, in the moment of greatest adversity, are the ones that truly shape who we are. It's easy to talk about courage when things are under control, but what about when you're in a situation where the only thing that can make a difference is your immediate action, with no time to think, no time to hesitate? What happens when you're challenged to act against everything society expects of you? The revelations Jake had during this confrontation weren't just about what he could do for those Apaches, but about what he was discovering about himself. Jake was immersed in the chaos of the confrontation, but around him, an icy clarity began to form. The fight wasn't just against the approaching gunman, but against his own sense of destiny and honor. There, in the crossfire, he knew he had to do more than simply fight for his own survival. He had to protect the innocent, those who couldn't defend themselves. And deep down, he knew he was about to make a decision few, if any, would make in that situation. He looked at the tribal woman who, with a child in her arms, tried to hide behind a rock, her eyes anguished, filled with fear and despair. Their eyes met for a brief second, and in that look, Jake saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: the fragility of life, the vulnerability of a mother trying to protect her children. The cowboy, as tough and unbeatable as he was, had never been indifferent to suffering. Even in the unforgiving world of the Old West, where violence and harshness were the norm, there was something there that touched him deeply. He knew that if he didn't act, those lives would be lost. It was a desperate situation, with no guarantee of success. Jake knew that taking the risk meant putting his own life in danger, perhaps even losing his chance to survive this battle. But what he feared most, what troubled him most, was not death, but the thought of failing to protect those who could not fight for themselves. He faced a moral dilemma that defied everything he had learned so far. True courage, he had realized, came not from the physical act of fighting, but from the decision to act in the face of a greater evil. He could hesitate no longer. With unwavering determination, Jake took a seemingly unthinkable action. He fired again, but this time it wasn't to defend himself. It was to defend someone who wasn't of his tribe, wasn't his blood, but who, at that moment, was as vulnerable as he was. He placed himself in front of the woman and children, opening a path between them and the armed men. He knew that if he failed, their fate would be sealed, but the only thing that mattered now was the chance to give them a chance to live. Time seemed to drag, each second an eternity. Jake moved forward with a courage he hadn't even known he possessed, pushing aside his own fears, defying everything the Old West taught him about survival. He was here for something more, something greater. It wasn't just about winning a battle, but about fighting for something that couldn't be easily achieved: the preservation of life, of hope, of humanity. He risked more than he had ever risked before, putting himself in a position where any mistake would be fatal. But in doing so, he did more than save lives. He showed the true face of courage. And this is where Jake's journey teaches us something profound. Because in the end, courage isn't about being unbeatable, but about being vulnerable enough to act, even when the odds are against you. Courage is about making the difficult choice, about exposing yourself to danger to ensure others have a chance. It's not about being a fearless hero, but about being a human being who, amidst chaos and violence, chooses to do what's right regardless of the consequences. What Jake did in that battle wasn't just an act of bravery. It was a manifestation of everything he believed to be right and just. He did what few would do. He risked himself to ensure that the stories of those innocent people wouldn't be tragically cut short. Jake's courage wasn't a momentary choice. It was a decision, a conviction that if he didn't fight for those who couldn't fight, he would be nothing more than a bystander to the violence. He knew his action might be the only thing that made a difference that day, and that, my friends, is what defines a true hero. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic because true courage, as we see in Jake's story, isn't something you find in history books or in great battles. True courage is what we see in the difficult choices of everyday life, in the decisions that define who we are, even when no one is looking. And perhaps, when you reflect on what Jake did, you'll ask yourself, what would I do faced with a situation like this? The fight intensified with each passing moment, but what seemed like a hopeless battle began to take an unexpected turn. Jake, unbeatable though he was, soon realized he couldn't do it alone. He was surrounded. Danger lurked in every direction, and the strength of his enemies seemed immeasurable. The fight was no longer just a matter of survival. It was a battle for the chance to resist, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, to fight for a cause that transcended any prejudice or group loyalty. It was at this moment that something surprising happened. The Native American family, until then visibly terrified and desperate, began to fight alongside him. The woman, with her son still in her arms, no longer shied away. She grabbed a small knife, an improvised weapon, and fought with the same intensity and courage Jake displayed. The children, though young, were no longer running in panic. They were there, beside the cowboy, in an act of resistance that united two worlds that, until that moment, had been separated by violence, fear, and misunderstanding. What seemed like a losing battle turned into a dance of survival, where everyone came together, oblivious to their differences, but with the sole purpose of staying alive. Jake looked at them, and in that look, he saw more than a family in danger. He saw what true human strength is capable of when there is unity, when everyone unites for a greater good, for something unrelated to skin color or origin. No matter how great the number of enemies, Jake knew that as long as the fight was shared, as long as there was courage among them, there was a chance of victory. That was what made the difference. It wasn't the number of weapons or the skill in shooting, but the strength that comes from the unity of those who, in any other context, would be enemies. Jake saw himself there, alongside those people, no longer as a cowboy fighting alone, but as a human being in the midst of a struggle for survival, where empathy, courage, and humanity intertwined. He was fighting not only to save himself, but to ensure those around him had a chance. He knew that if that family fell, not only would his journey end, but the cycle of violence and distrust would continue. It was a chance to break down the barriers that had been erected between people, to show that when it comes to survival, everyone has something to offer, regardless of their background. The enemy, seeing the unexpected unity between Jake and his family, began to hesitate. This was no longer a fight between two separate groups, but a true battle for justice and life. And this began to shake the attackers' plans. When a man's heart is touched by the courage and unity of others, he begins to question his own motivations, his own principles. The resistance Jake and the Apaches were offering wasn't just physical, it was emotional resistance, a demonstration that, no matter how cruel the circumstances, there was always something stronger than fear, the will to fight for what was right, for what was just. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because when we talk about unity, we're touching on something fundamental in the human journey. It's not just about fighting alongside those you know or have a connection with. It's about realizing that in moments of despair, what unites us is much stronger than what divides us. When Jake joined that Native American family, he wasn't just protecting the innocent. He was embracing the possibility of transformation, of understanding that in fact we are all part of the same journey. And this revelation wasn't just about saving lives, but about the impact a simple choice can have on changing everything. Jake never imagined that in a life-or-death battle, he would find allies where he least expected them. But this, in fact, was what gave him the strength to carry on. When you open yourself to the true strength that comes from collaboration, from unity, you begin to realize that the greatest victories come not from what you achieve alone, but from what you achieve together. And this isn't just a lesson for the Old West. It's a lesson we can take into our own lives. What Jake discovered there in that desert, in that fight for survival, was something many of us have spent years understanding. True power comes from our ability to unite, to see each other not as an enemy, but as someone with whom we can share the journey. And when that happens, the battle begins to shift. It's no longer just about survival. It's about something much bigger. It's about transformation. The sound of gunfire seemed to dominate everything around him. The dust in the air, the screams, the gunfire, the sound of bullets ricocheting off rocks and dry earth, all of it created a storm of chaos, a violence that seemed relentless. Jake, adrenaline coursing through his veins, felt he was on edge. The gunmen were advancing more forcefully, and with each shot the feeling that he couldn't protect everyone grew. The fighting was intensifying, and Jake knew time was running out. He had to act, had to do something to change the course of the battle. But he also knew that doing so could cost him his life. That was when the truth about courage revealed itself even more profoundly to him. Jake could no longer fight with the hope of survival alone. It wouldn't be enough. He had to risk everything. He had to take radical action if he truly wanted to ensure that those who depended on him, especially the tribe's women and children, had a chance of survival. It was a sacrifice he never imagined making, but at that moment, it seemed like the only option. Without hesitation, he exposed himself to danger in a way he would never have considered otherwise. He advanced to a position where his enemies could clearly see him, creating a distraction that would force them to focus on him, not the family he was trying to protect. The idea was simple but dangerous. He knew that exposing himself in this way increased his chances of being hit, but he also knew it would give those with him a real opportunity to escape, to survive. What Jake did there was a personal sacrifice, not just physical, but emotional and psychological. He was putting his life on the line in a way he had never considered before. Jake's choice wasn't just about doing what was right. It was about acting, even knowing it could mean his death. He was willing to pay the ultimate price because he knew that in the end, what mattered wasn't his survival, but the chance to protect those he knew couldn't fight alone. As he exposed himself to enemy fire, he felt a strange calm, an acceptance of what was to come. He felt no fear. On the contrary, what dominated his heart was a sense of duty accomplished, that he had made the right choice. There was nothing left to fear, because he knew that by acting this way, he had given his all. True courage lay not in facing the enemy with weapons drawn, but in putting oneself at risk so that others might have a chance, even if it meant paying the price for that protection. The fight continued, and Jake felt everyone's eyes on him. It wasn't just his enemies watching him now. He felt the gaze of the tribeswoman, his children, and even his own feelings. He had given everything he had, expecting nothing in return. He was no longer fighting to save himself, but to ensure that those lives, those defenseless souls, had a chance to live. And in doing so, Jake realized that in that moment, he had transformed. No longer just the tough cowboy, but a man willing to go to the end to protect others. That sacrifice, that radical action had changed not only the course of the battle, but the very essence of who he was. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because this moment of sacrifice teaches us something far more valuable than the simple idea of heroism. When you choose to act courageously in the face of a situation where all is lost, you're not just facing physical danger, but also your own limits, your own convictions. And what Jake did there was dismantle those limits, go beyond what he thought he was capable of. He shows us that the true strength of a human being lies not only in endurance, but in the willingness to sacrifice oneself for something greater than oneself. Jake's sacrifice, his choice to put himself in harm's way to ensure the survival of others, is what transforms an ordinary person into a hero. And that's why, more than ever, Jake's story makes us reflect on our own choices, on the times we've been challenged to sacrifice something for a greater good. Because, in the end, that's what defines our true strength. Not how much we can achieve, but how much we're willing to risk to ensure others have a chance too. The seemingly endless confrontation began to show signs of coming to an end. The sound of bullets faded. The screams and hurried footsteps of the enemy grew more distant. Jake, wounded and exhausted, still stood, his eyes focused on the tribeswoman and the children he had protected. The flames of battle died down, and the desert, which had previously seemed a field of death and destruction, was now silent. But the calm that followed was not just the end of a physical conflict, it was the beginning of something much deeper. Jake looked at the Apaches. What had begun as a struggle for survival, a battle between those long-considered enemies, had now given way to a strange sense of complicity. He and the tribal woman exchanged meaningful glances. She, who had previously trembled with fear, now watched him with silent respect, a mutual recognition that, despite all the violence and separation between them, something had changed, something irreversible. She, who could never have imagined that a cowboy, a man on the other side of the war, would be the key to her survival, now viewed him with a gratitude almost impossible to express in words. In the heart of the desert, where the wind still carried the scent of battle, an unlikely alliance was forming. There, in that moment, Jake and his Native American family were united not just by the struggle, but by something deeper, something that transcends any division, any prejudice. They were united by shared experience, by the struggle for survival, by the hidden truth that, in the end, we are all human, all seeking safety, protection, and a future for those we love. The struggle, which seemed to be about the division between two peoples, now revealed a much deeper reality. True strength comes from unity, from empathy, and from the courage to step back, to see the other not as an enemy, but as someone who at some point also had to fight to survive. What happened there was more than a victory in battle. It was a victory over prejudice, over the barriers that had been erected over generations. Jake, the lone cowboy, had somehow become part of something greater than his own survival. He had given everything he had, even the limit, to save people who, until then, had been seen as enemies. And in that moment, he realized that the true legacy of his journey would not be the fame of being a great cowboy, but the truth that he had been able to see the humanity in others, to fight for it, and in the process, transform his own worldview. The tribeswoman, who had previously viewed him with distrust and fear, now extended her hand in a gesture of gratitude and respect. She knew that, despite their differences, Jake's courage and compassion had been the keys to his survival. She knew that the alliance they had formed there, in that arid and unforgiving desert, was stronger than any war, any enemy. It was an alliance of survival, but also an alliance of transformation. They had transformed into each other, and from that moment on, the barriers between them would never be the same. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because what truly happened there wasn't just a change in circumstances, but an internal transformation for everyone involved. The true lesson of this story lies not only in what happened on that battlefield, but in the emotional impact and shift in mindset that followed. How can each of us in our own daily challenges find points of connection, of humanity, even with those we once considered our enemies? What Jake and the Apaches truly teach us is that when we are willing to see each other as someone who shares the same human journey, barriers begin to fall and new possibilities open up. In the end, that unlikely alliance was more than a symbol of victory. It was a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments, we can find light in unity, empathy, and the courage to be better for each other. Looking back, everything that happened that afternoon in the desert seemed to have been a coincidence. But at the same time, the power of that story, the power of Jake and his Native American family's choices, teaches us something much greater than simply the heroic act of saving lives. Every step, every decision, every moment of courage shows us that, in times of adversity, it is the most unlikely alliances that can emerge from the most desperate situations. What seemed like a hopeless battle became a lesson in humanity, unity, and compassion. Jake, the lone cowboy, faced his own internal barriers, and in doing so, saw the world in a completely new way. He wasn't just fighting the enemies before him, but the mindset that separated him from true human connection. He made difficult choices, choices that challenged him to go beyond what he believed possible, and in the end, the reward was much more than survival. It was the internal transformation that happens when you decide to see another not as an enemy, but as someone with whom you can share the journey. And this brings us to a fundamental question. What would you do if you were in Jake's position? If someone's life depended on your courage, would you risk it? Would you make the necessary sacrifice to protect those who cannot protect themselves? We are often called to act in ways that challenge our own beliefs and fears. And as we saw in Jake's story, when we make these decisions, we are not only changing the fate of others, but also our own. We are creating a new narrative, a new way of understanding the world and our relationships. This story invites us to reflect on the impact we can have on others' lives, even when we're surrounded by adversity. Each of us at some point will be challenged to act courageously, to make decisions that go beyond our comfort zone. And in those moments, the most unlikely alliances can be the ones that most transform our lives. Now I want to hear from you. What would you do if you were in Jake's shoes? How would you react in a situation where someone's life was in your hands? Leave your thoughts and reflections on this journey of courage, sacrifice, and transformation in the comments. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story touched your heart. Courage, sacrifice, transformation. These are the lessons that last, aren't they? And I truly hope you found something valuable in this content, something that makes you see the world a little differently. If so, how about giving the video a like? It really helps us continue bringing you stories that touch you, that make a difference. And of course, it motivates me to keep sharing these experiences with you. Oh, and if you're enjoying this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. Here you'll always find stories that make you reflect, move you, and perhaps even transform the way you see the world. I'm happy to know I'm following you on this journey, and each new video is a chance for us to dive even deeper. Now, to conclude this reflection, tell me, what do you think courage can transform in your life? Answer in the comments, because I'd love to hear your opinion. And if you still want to continue on this path of stories that challenge us to be better, there's another video right here that will move you too. Click and join me, because I guarantee this journey of reflection and transformation doesn't end here.